There are breakups filled with tears, where emotions explode like a storm, leaving behind shattered hearts and broken promises. There are breakups fueled by anger, words exchanged like daggers, cutting deep and leaving wounds that take years to heal. And then some breakups unfold in silence. A silence so deliberate, so calculated, that it becomes a slow, suffocating kind of cruelty. Jack never had to say he wanted to leave me. He didn't need to. He simply let the distance grow, let the conversations shrink, let his presence turn into a void that I could no longer reach. No arguments, no fights, just an unspoken withdrawal, a punishment I didn't know I was serving. At first, I blamed myself. Maybe I was overthinking, maybe I was too sensitive, maybe, just maybe, he was going through something and I needed to be patient. But patience, I would learn, was just another word for self-inflicted suffering in a toxic relationship. Jack knew what he was doing. He wanted me to break first. He wanted me to feel the weight of his silent treatment, to question my worth, to drive myself into an unbearable loneliness until I was the one who walked away. And when I finally did, he played his part flawlessly. The heartbroken man, the abandoned lover. And me, I became the villain in his story. The woman who changed, the woman who left. But was I really the one who walked away first, or did he just push me there and watch from a distance? My name is Lucy. For 5 years, Jack and I built a life together, a life I once believed was unshakable. We had routines, inside jokes, a rhythm that made me feel safe. We weren't perfect, but we were solid. Or at least, I thought we were. Then things changed. It started subtly, the way distance creeps in like a shadow, stretching longer as the sun sets. At first, I didn't even notice. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he was stressed from work. Maybe I convinced myself love simply evolves, trading passion for comfort, intensity for stability. But stability doesn't feel like this. Jack stopped texting me first. Our late-night conversations, the ones where we'd talk about everything and nothing, died down to polite exchanges. His touch became mechanical, absent of the unconscious affection he once showered me with. He no longer reached for my hand while driving. No longer pulled me close as we watched movies on the couch. And it wasn't just the absence of affection. It was the way he looked at me, like I was there, but not really. Like I was a piece of furniture he had grown used to seeing, but no longer noticed. "Jack," I asked one evening as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, "is something wrong?" He didn't even look up. "No," he said, stabbing at his food. That was it. No elaboration, no reassurance. Just a single detached word that felt like a locked door in my face. I let it go that night, telling myself I was imagining things. But the signs were there, glaring and undeniable, unraveling everything I thought we had. I started trying harder. I made his favorite meals. I planned surprise dates. I lingered by his side, hoping he'd pull me in the way he used to. Nothing worked. One night I reached for his hand as we lay in bed. He flinched, as if my touch startled him. "Jack?" My voice was barely above a whisper. His sigh was long, irritated, like I had asked him for too much. "I'm tired, Lucy." I rolled onto my back, staring at the ceiling, feeling the cold space between us stretch wider. Something was wrong, but the worst part? He wouldn't tell me what it was. I tried to convince myself that relationships go through phases, that people sometimes drift before they find their way back to each other. But deep down, I knew this wasn't temporary. It was deliberate. At first, I blamed myself. Maybe I had been too needy, too emotional. Maybe I hadn't given him enough space. I started second-guessing every interaction, analyzing every word I said, every text I sent. I stopped asking him how his day was because I was afraid of the empty response I'd get. I stopped initiating affection because I couldn't bear the way he pulled away. I stopped being myself. And still, he gave me nothing. I confided in my best friend, Emily. We sat in a small cafe on a rainy afternoon, steam rising from our cups of coffee. She watched me with quiet concern as I stirred mine absent-mindedly. "I don't know what's happening," I admitted. "It's like he's just shutting me out." Emily frowned. "Have you asked him why?" "Of course I have." I laughed bitterly. "But he won't give me an answer. He just exists near me, but it's like he's already left." She sighed, setting her cup down. "Lucy, do you think there's someone else?" The question knocked the air out of my lungs. I had thought about it. Of course I had. But I had pushed the idea away because the alternative, that Jack was choosing to ignore me just to see how long I'd endure it, was somehow worse. "I don't know," I whispered. "Maybe." She reached across the table, squeezing my hand. "You deserve better than this." But did I? Because Jack hadn't cheated. He hadn't yelled at me or treated me cruelly. He hadn't done anything. And somehow, that was worse. One evening, I watched him from across the room, trying to remember the last time he had really looked at me, really seen me. The man I fell in love with had been passionate, full of laughter and energy. The man in front of me now was distant, detached, a ghost of the person he used to be. And then it hit me. Jack wasn't just drifting away, he wanted me to leave. Not in an explosive, dramatic way. That would have required effort, confrontation. No, he wanted me to make the choice for him, to bear the weight of the decision so that he wouldn't have to. He wanted me to be the one who broke. I sat there, realization sinking in like lead in my stomach. This wasn't just neglect, it was intentional. A slow psychological unraveling. A punishment disguised as indifference. He didn't need to say, "I don't love you anymore." He just needed to make me feel it. And I did. I didn't leave Jack right away, even when his silence became unbearable. Even when every conversation felt like speaking into a void. Even when I felt lonelier in his presence than I ever did alone. I stayed. I convinced myself that love required patience, that relationships weren't always easy, that people went through phases. I told myself that if I just tried harder, if I just waited long enough, things would go back to the way they were. So I endured. I made excuses for him, to myself, to Emily, to anyone who noticed how dull my eyes had become. Jack is just busy, I would say. Jack is going through something. And when no one else was around, I would whisper to myself, Jack still loves me. But love is not meant to feel like drowning. And waiting for someone to save you when they are the one pushing you underwater is a slow, agonizing way to die. Then I met Chris. It wasn't planned. I wasn't looking for anything, not even friendship. I had already started shrinking inside myself, retreating into a shell I barely recognized, and I figured that was just my reality now. But life has a way of throwing you a rope when you least expect it. I met Chris at a bookstore, one of those small, quiet ones tucked between coffee shops and forgotten alleyways. I was staring at a shelf, not really reading the titles, just lost in my own thoughts, when he spoke. "Are you actually reading that book?" he asked, "or just pretending so people don't talk to you?" I blinked, startled, before glancing at the book in my hands. I hadn't even noticed what I had picked up. I hesitated, then exhaled a soft laugh. "I guess the second one." He smiled. It wasn't charming in an obvious way, not the kind of smile that made you swoon in movies. It was real, effortless, like he had no expectations for what I was supposed to say next. And that's how it started. Not with grand gestures, not with instant sparks or stolen glances, just a conversation. A conversation that, for the first time in months, felt genuine. Chris was easy to talk to. He had a way of making space for words, for emotions, without demanding them. He didn't ask what was wrong, but I found myself telling him anyway. Not all of it, just pieces, just enough. And piece by piece, I felt something shift inside me. I felt seen. It was such a simple thing, and yet it felt revolutionary. Jack used to look through me, past me, like I was a reflection on a window pane. Chris, on the other hand, looked at me as though I was a person with thoughts and emotions that mattered. For the first time in so long, I wasn't holding my breath, waiting for a reaction, an acknowledgement, a sign that I was still wanted. For the first time, I laughed without wondering if someone else found it annoying. For the first time, I felt alive. And Jack noticed. I didn't think he would. He had spent so long pretending I wasn't there, I assumed he wouldn't care if I stopped orbiting around him. But he did. He never said anything outright. He didn't ask where I had been when I started coming home later. He didn't accuse me of anything. He just watched. Like a predator who had left a trap and was waiting to see if it had worked. One night I came home late, later than usual. The bookstore had closed, but I had stayed outside talking to Chris, neither of us in a rush to leave. The air was crisp, the streetlights buzzing softly, and for once I had forgotten what it felt like to be weighed down by neglect, disguised as patience. I unlocked the door quietly, stepping inside. Jack was sitting in the dimly lit living room, his face unreadable. The TV was on, but I knew he wasn't watching it. I set my keys down on the table, suddenly aware of how much the silence in this house felt different from the silence I had just left. Jack looked at me. "You've changed," he said. Not a question, not an accusation, just a statement. I stood there, the weight of his words settling in my chest, because he was right. I had changed. Not in the way he wanted me to, not in defeat, not in submission, but in realization. I was no longer drowning. And Jack, he had never wanted me to leave. He just wanted to watch me break. And now that I wasn't breaking, now that I was finding pieces of myself outside of him, he was watching something else unfold. Something he hadn't planned for. Jack didn't ask where I had been. He didn't question me, didn't demand an explanation, didn't lash out in anger the way I had once feared he might. He didn't even feign concern. He simply looked at me. A slow, measured glance, his expression unreadable, but his silence heavy enough to fill every corner of the dimly lit room. I knew that look. It was the same one he gave me every time he wanted me to doubt myself. The same look that had once made me second-guess every word I spoke, every action I took, every moment I sought validation from him and found only emptiness in return. But tonight, there was something different about it. Tonight, he wasn't just indifferent. He was waiting for me to break first. I set my keys down on the kitchen counter, the sound louder than I had intended. My pulse thrummed in my ears as I forced myself to meet his gaze. I refused to speak first. Jack exhaled, slow and deliberate, before shifting on the couch. The glow from the television flickered across his face, casting shadows that made him look even more distant, even more unreachable than before. "You've changed," he had told me the night before. And now he was watching to see what I would do with that truth. The silence stretched between us, thick with everything unsaid. He wasn't angry. He wasn't pleading. But that was the point. If he had yelled, if he had accused me, then I would have something to fight against. Something tangible. But Jack was too calculated for that. Instead, he let the weight of my own thoughts become the punishment. I could feel it creeping in, the guilt, the self-doubt, the need to explain myself when I had done nothing wrong. Had I done something wrong? I had met someone who made me feel alive. Someone who didn't make me feel like I was slowly disappearing. But Jack had never said I wasn't allowed to do that. He had never asked me to stay. And yet, standing there in the silence of our home, I could feel the invisible chains he had placed around me tightening. I opened my mouth, not even sure what I was about to say, an explanation, an apology, an excuse. But Jack spoke first. He didn't accuse, he didn't ask for anything. He simply leaned back, folded his arms, and gave me a look so quiet yet so devastatingly effective that it pulled me back into his game before I even realized I was playing it. A look that said, "You're the one who's wrong here." I knew what he was doing. He wanted me to be the one who said it. He wanted me to admit that I was the one who had changed, that I was the one who was slipping away, that I was the one who had ruined everything. Because if I did, then he wouldn't have to. And if I left, then I would be the one who walked away. And he would be the victim, the one who had loved me through it all, only to watch me slip out of his grasp. The one who had tried to hold on but had been left behind. I could already hear the words he would tell others. She changed. She started acting different. I don't know what happened. And they would believe him. Because people always believe the one who looks like they've been left behind. I clenched my fingers into my palms, nails digging into my skin. I had spent months, years waiting for Jack to fight for me. And now I realized he never would. Because this was the fight. Not an argument, not an explosion of emotions, but this, a quiet, insidious manipulation designed to make me doubt myself just enough to fall into the trap he had laid for me. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. I wanted to speak. I wanted to tell him that I knew what he was doing, that I wasn't playing his game anymore. But I didn't trust my voice not to shake. So instead, I did the only thing I could. I turned away. And as I walked past him, as I felt his gaze follow me, as I closed the bedroom door behind me, I realized something that sent a cold chill through my spine. He had already won. Because even though I hadn't said a word, I still felt guilty. It had only been a week. 7 days since I had packed my things, closed the door behind me, and walked away from the silent battlefield Jack had spent months orchestrating. 7 days since I had last seen his face, still unreadable, still unbothered, as if watching me leave had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. I should have known that was only the beginning. 2 days. That's how long it took before Jack had someone new. I heard about her before I even saw her. A friend, one of those who still floated somewhere between my world and his, texted me, her message laced with hesitant sympathy. "Lucy, I don't know if you want to know this, but Jack has been seeing someone. Already. She was with him at the coffee shop this morning." I had to read it twice before the words sank in. Already. The word sat bitter in my mouth, but I forced myself to swallow it down. I had spent months, maybe longer, preparing myself for this moment. I knew Jack wouldn't stay single for long. That wasn't who he was. He needed an audience, needed someone to validate him, needed a mirror to reflect the image he carefully curated for the world. But 2 days? It was almost insulting how little effort he put into making it seem like he had struggled with our breakup. And then, I saw them. It was a Saturday. I had gone out to pick up a few things for my new place, a tiny apartment that still smelled of fresh paint and possibilities. The air was crisp, and for the first time in a long time, I had allowed myself to breathe in something other than anxiety. Then I turned the corner. And there he was. Jack, walking with her. She was younger, prettier in the way that made people look twice. She clung to his arm, leaning into him as if they had been together for years instead of days. She saw me first. I recognized the way her expression shifted, curiosity giving way to something sharper. Recognition. Jack had prepared her for this moment. She knew who I was before I even had the chance to introduce myself. And she hated me, not because of anything I had done, not because she knew the truth, but because she knew his truth, the version of the story he had fed her. I could already hear the words he had whispered in the dark, in the quiet spaces where he could mold the narrative however he pleased. She changed. She wasn't the same person anymore. I tried everything, but she pulled away first. The words clung to the air between us, invisible but suffocating. Jack didn't look surprised to see me. If anything, he looked prepared. Like he had been waiting for this moment, for the inevitable collision between past and present. He didn't say a word, but the slight tilt of his head, the way his fingers flexed against hers, told me everything I needed to know. "You see?" His body language seemed to whisper. "I've moved on. I've found someone who doesn't leave. Someone who doesn't change. I should have walked away. I should have let it go, let him have his perfect little act, his carefully crafted victimhood. But I didn't. Because as much as I had prepared myself for Jack's next move, I hadn't prepared myself for the way seeing it play out in real time would feel. Like a hand closing around my throat, like I was drowning all over again. Because it wasn't just that he had moved on. It was the way he had erased me from the story entirely. He hadn't told her about the silent treatment. He hadn't told her how he had spent months conditioning me to believe that I was the problem, that I was the one who had drifted away, that I was the one who had ruined us. He hadn't told her that his neglect wasn't passive, it was calculated. No. He had told her the version that people always want to believe. The one where the man is heartbroken and the woman is the villain. Because it's easy, isn't it? It's easy to look at a man with sad eyes and an empty bed and believe he must have been wronged. It's easy to pity him, to assume that the woman who left must have done so carelessly, selfishly, without reason. It's easier to believe that than to believe the truth. That sometimes the person who looks like the victim is really the one who set the fire in the first place. I could feel the weight of their stares, hers filled with quiet contempt, his filled with quiet triumph. But something strange happened then. The guilt that had been wrapped around my ribs for so long, the guilt that Jack had carefully planted, watered, and nurtured, began to wither. Because I knew the truth, and the truth was something he could never change. He could rewrite the story for everyone else. He could paint himself as the wounded lover, the man who had tried everything, the one who had been left behind. But he could never change what really happened. He could never erase the months of silence, the way he had watched me wither under his indifference, the way he had waited patiently for me to walk away so he wouldn't have to be the bad guy. The truth would always be etched into my bones. And no matter how many times he told his version, no matter how many people believed it, he would always know it too. So I met his gaze, and I smiled. Not out of happiness, not out of kindness, but because I wanted him to know I saw through it all. I saw the script he had written, I saw the mask he had carefully placed over his face, and I saw the cracks forming underneath it. I turned away, my steps light, my heart steady. Let him play his role, let them believe what they wanted. Because the people who mattered, they would see the truth. Eventually, they always did. I used to think that when a relationship ended, the hardest part was leaving the person. But I was wrong. Leaving Jack was painful, yes, but what lingered, what clung to me like smoke after a fire, was everything else. The weight of whispers behind my back, the judgment of people who saw only what Jack had allowed them to see, the way I had to rebuild my identity in a world that had already labeled me the villain in his story. Some of my so-called friends had made their choice. They didn't ask me how I felt. They didn't ask me what had happened. Instead, they took the version Jack had given them. The one where I was the ungrateful woman who had walked away from a man who had done everything for her. And they let that be the truth. At first, I tried to explain. I tried to tell them about the silence, the gaslighting, the manipulation so subtle it had taken me years to see it for what it was. But their eyes would glaze over, their minds already made up. Maybe you're just overthinking it. Jack's not like that. You were such a great couple. I don't understand why you had to leave. And that was the moment I realized something. It wasn't just Jack I had to walk away from. It was them, too. People who only saw what they wanted to see. People who clung to a version of the past that never truly existed. People who would never understand that just because someone doesn't hit you, doesn't scream at you, doesn't cheat on you, it doesn't mean they haven't been broken in ways that are just as damaging. So I let them go. And in doing so, I freed myself. Starting over felt strange at first. I had spent so long second-guessing myself, so long being conditioned to believe that love meant waiting for someone to stop ignoring me, that the idea of something healthy felt almost unnatural. Chris didn't push. He didn't rush. He was just there. A steady presence, a safe space I didn't realize I had been searching for until I found it. We started as friends, real friends. He never pried, never tried to dig into the wounds I wasn't ready to show. But when I did open up, little by little, he listened. Not with that kind of forced patience people have when they're waiting for their turn to speak, but with a quiet understanding, a reassurance that I didn't need to perform or explain myself. And slowly, I healed. 3 months passed, and I barely recognized myself. Not because I had changed into someone else, but because I had returned to who I was before Jack made me believe I wasn't enough. And somewhere along the way, something shifted between Chris and me. I don't know exactly when it happened. Maybe it was in the way he always made sure I got home safe. Maybe it was in the way he never made me guess what he was thinking. Maybe it was in the way he saw me, truly saw me, without expecting me to prove my worth. One evening, we were sitting on my couch, the warmth of late summer slipping through the open window. I was laughing, one of those real unguarded laughs that I hadn't heard from myself in years, and when I looked at Chris, he was already watching me. His gaze wasn't calculating, like Jack's had been. It wasn't full of expectation or silent judgment. It was certain, and for the first time I wasn't afraid of certainty. Chris didn't make me guess if he cared. He didn't make me wonder if I mattered. When he loved me, he told me. When something was wrong, he talked to me. When I felt insecure, he reassured me instead of punishing me with silence. And it was in those small, quiet moments that I realized something. Love is not supposed to feel like war. It's not supposed to feel like a battlefield where one person is always fighting to be noticed, to be heard, to be loved just enough to stay. It's supposed to be safe. It's supposed to be kind. It's supposed to be something that builds you up, not something that makes you question your worth every single day. For years, I had thought that suffering in silence was just part of love. That if I was patient enough, if I proved myself enough, then eventually I would be worthy of the affection I craved. But Chris showed me that love wasn't something I had to earn. It was something I deserved. And finally, I believed it. Jack moved on quickly. Or at least that's what it looked like from the outside. In the months that followed our breakup, I would occasionally hear whispers, stories about him with different women, fleeting romances that burned bright and fizzled out just as quickly. At first, I thought maybe he had finally found what he was looking for. Maybe, after everything, he had changed. Maybe he had learned. But then, I saw it for myself. It was a chance encounter, one of those moments that fate orchestrates just to remind you of what you've left behind. I was sitting at a cafe downtown, the kind with warm wooden tables and the scent of roasted coffee lingering in the air. Chris had gone inside to grab our drinks, and I was absent-mindedly scrolling through my phone when I heard a voice. Jack's voice. I looked up instinctively, and there he was. He was sitting at a table near the window, across from a woman I didn't recognize. She was beautiful, the kind of beautiful that turned heads without trying. But she looked tense, like she was waiting for something to go wrong. I knew that look. I had worn that look. Jack was speaking, but she wasn't listening. Not really. Her eyes darted to the side, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup, her expression distant, in a way that felt all too familiar. And then I saw Jack's face. The way his jaw tensed when she didn't respond the way he expected. The flicker of impatience in his eyes. The way he leaned back, exhaling sharply, like she had somehow failed him without even knowing what she had done wrong. It was like watching a scene from my past play out in front of me. And suddenly, I understood. Jack hadn't changed. He hadn't learned. He was still caught in the same pattern, playing the same game, setting the same trap, only now with a different woman sitting across from him, unaware of what she was walking into. Chris came back with our coffees, setting them down in front of me. He followed my gaze, then looked back at me. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice steady, grounding. I nodded, and I meant it, because for the first time, I wasn't looking at Jack with anger, or pain, or regret. I was looking at him with clarity. Jack wasn't happy. For all his carefully constructed appearances, for all the ways he had painted himself as the victim in our story, he was still chasing something he would never be able to hold on to. He wanted control, but he feared commitment. He wanted to be adored, but he didn't know how to love in return. He wanted stability, but only on his terms, where he dictated the rules, where he decided when to be present and when to disappear. And so his relationships never lasted. The women came and went, each one leaving a little faster than the last, because sooner or later they all realized what I had realized. Jack wasn't looking for love. He was looking for someone to fit the role he had written for them. And when they inevitably disappointed him, when they asked for too much, or questioned his silence, or simply refused to break the way he needed them to, he let them go, or made them leave, just like he had done with me. Chris reached across the table, brushing his fingers against mine, and I smiled at him. Because this was different. This was real. This was mutual. Jack saw me then. For a brief second, our eyes met through the window, and I saw something flicker across his expression. Recognition. Not longing. Not nostalgia. Just the simple, quiet realization that I was no longer part of his world. And maybe, just maybe, a part of him understood that I had been the one who truly won. I turned back to Chris, lifting my coffee with a steady hand. Jack could keep playing his games, but I wasn't a piece on his board anymore. Jack thought he had won. He thought I would carry the guilt with me, that I would spend years questioning myself, wondering if I had been the one who ruined us. He thought I would regret leaving, that I would look back and wish I had fought harder, endured longer. But he was wrong. Because the moment I truly won wasn't when I walked away. It wasn't even when I found love again with Chris. It was when I stopped looking back. For so long, Jack had been the shadow hanging over me, a presence I had carried even in his absence. Every choice I made, every feeling I had, was tangled up in what he had done to me. But shadows only exist when you keep the light behind you. And I had turned to face the sun. I didn't think about Jack much anymore. I didn't wonder if he had changed, if he had finally found someone who could endure his silence without breaking. I didn't wonder if he ever regretted losing me. Because it didn't matter. The past wasn't my burden to carry anymore. I had built something new. A life that wasn't defined by his neglect, his games, his carefully curated role as the victim. A life that was full, not because I had replaced him, but because I had finally reclaimed myself. And Jack Jack was still stuck in the cycle he had created, still searching for something he couldn't name, still crafting new versions of the same tired story, playing the same role, setting the same traps, still watching women walk away and wondering why they always did. His punishment was never losing me. It was never seeing me happy without him. It was never even knowing that I had moved on. No, his punishment was far worse. It was waking up every day and realizing that he was still the same. That no matter how many times he started over, no matter how many different people he brought into his life, he was still alone in the way that truly mattered. And maybe, just maybe, there was a moment, just one, where he understood that the real victory had never been about making someone else suffer. It had always been about learning how to love. And that was something he had never figured out how to do. I took a deep breath, looking out at the world I had built for myself. Jack was nothing more than a name in a chapter I had already finished. And the best part? I didn't need him to know that. Because this, my happiness, my peace, my freedom, was never about proving anything to him. It was about proving it to myself. I don't feel guilty anymore. Not for choosing happiness. Not for walking away from a love that was never really love. Not for letting go of friends who only saw me through the lens of someone else's lies. For so long, I had been trapped, not by Jack, not by the silence he wrapped around me, but by my own fear of being alone. But I am not afraid anymore. Because I've learned that I don't need someone who doesn't love me. I don't need friends who don't trust me. I only need myself. And love? The real kind. The kind that doesn't punish you for existing. It comes when you are no longer searching for someone to complete you. It comes when you are whole on your own, when you stand strong in who you are, when you refuse to shrink just to fit into someone else's expectations. That's what I found with Chris. Not a rescue, not a replacement, but a love that met me where I was, without conditions, without control. And that's the only kind of love worth having. So, to those who have listened to my story, thank you. I have been through pain, and I have found happiness. But if there is one thing I wish for you, it's that you never have to endure the suffering before you find your peace. I hope you see your worth before someone else tries to make you question it, because the moment you choose yourself, you've already won.